Imagine you're working as a professional. You could be a doctor, a human resource manager, an engineer. How would you describe the ideal client? Now, imagine you're the client of this imaginary professional. How would you describe the ideal professional? Are there any similarities between what we should expect from each other? Is there a disjunct between these expectations? How do we know what's fair to expect from the other person? Hi, Dr. Lee here with another lesson, and this time we're talking about the moral components surrounding a professional-client relationship. Now, if you don't know what a professional is, you may want to take a look at Michael Bale's standard definition, and I'll provide a link down below. So, what did you conclude? Are there any similarities between the expectations of a professional and a client? Are there any dissimilarities? Are there any ways to decide what is fair to expect from the other person? Judith Andre argues that sometimes professionals use their perception of their client to dictate or to justify certain subpar actions towards their client. Rather than using moral obligation to set the standard for how a professional should handle and treat a client, sometimes our perception changes what we do and how we do certain things. So what does this mean? First, she looks at the concept of success. What does success look like in your field? And while there might be a quick answer to that question, the issue is much more complex. What often looks like quote-unquote success within a field may change the way in which we treat a client, because this client or that client doesn't necessarily help the professional achieve that goal of success. Also, she looks at the concept of learning. Often many of the tasks that a professional may conduct for a client are things that he or she can easily do. And due to the ease of these tasks, or sometimes, frankly, the boredom of these tasks, a professional might change the way in which they handle certain clients or certain tasks. Again, due to the ease of these tasks, it might be a bit loose with these activities. Third, she looks at the concept of emotion. While when a professional has an emotional connection to a client, that is great for the relationship and things usually work out great, but sometimes there's a lack of emotional connection. In these cases where there's a lack of emotional connection, Andre argues that this should not change how the professional treats and deals with the client. Fourth, the concept of respect. And here, this is very similar to the concept of success. Certain clients will garner a certain amount of respect from the professional's peers. And due to this, certain clients might get certain privileges or not. And again, just like success, this shouldn't change how a professional deals with or treats with a client. And then lastly, the concept of time. We all know that everyone runs out of time, or there's not enough time in a day to do this or do that. But again, Andre argues that the lack of time shouldn't necessarily dictate how one deals with a client or treats a client. Rather, again, the idea that the moral obligation the professional has to the client, that should be the driving force and the motivator behind the relationship between the professional and the client. Andrew Alexander and Sumas Miller addresses the significance of the professional-client relationship, specifically addressing the concept of fundamental needs. Often when a professional is working for a client, it's the idea that the professional is meeting significant needs. And not only is a professional meeting these fundamental needs, often they are the only ones who can meet these fundamental needs, according to Bale's definition. So what do we mean by a fundamental need? I can say, I need $200 to buy a bike. While that might be true, we're not necessarily talking about a fundamental need. The $200 is a non-fundamental need. Sure, there are bikes that are $200. There's bikes that are way more than $200, but then there's also bikes that are way less than $200. So that $200 is a non-fundamental need. The bike itself may be a mere desire. I don't necessarily need a bike. I could get around by walking. I could take the bus. I could maybe hop in a car. Either way, the bicycle is a mere desire. So what is the fundamental need in this situation? The fundamental need would be a means for transportation. Given the infrastructure of a society, yes, there are certain things I could get to by walking, but the vast majority of places I can't get to by mere walking. So the need for transportation is fundamental. So how does this play out in the professional field? I might own a Korean restaurant and I go to a web designer to gain further online presence and be able to get my contact information out there so customers could easily find me. I might say I want a website with pictures of my food, obviously my phone number or email, but I also want to throw in perhaps maybe a social media platform. And let's throw some K-pop music playing over the website. Now the web designer might say, yeah, I could do all these things for you, but what you really need is X, Y, and Z. In doing so, the web designer is moving beyond mere desires and things that might actually hurt my business and take away from what I really need, which is web presence, and a way for my customers to get my contact information and maybe even order online. So what the professional is doing in this situation is the web designer is meeting my fundamental needs. And my fundamental needs for financial stability through allowing my customers to see my food and to find where I'm located and be able to contact me and even order online. Those are the things that the web designer is trying to meet and fulfill, and not necessarily these desires for, say, again, a social media platform or other things that might distract from what I'm really trying to get at with this web page. So this takes us to the topic of a professional client relationship. How do we figure out what we should be doing as a professional when a client has certain wants or certain desires? What is the best way to form an effective and morally sound relationship between the professional and the client? Paul Faber offers 5 relationships, and each of these relationships differs on essentially 2 central concepts. First is the idea of freedom and autonomy. In any of these relationships, the professional and the client has varying degrees of freedom and autonomy. What the professional can do and what the professional can't do, and what the client is allowed to do and what the client is not allowed to do. The second component of this relationship is the concept of trust. How much trust is there in this relationship? Does the professional trust the client to do what the client is supposed to do? And does the client trust the professional to do what the professional is supposed to do? So again, in any one of these 5 relationships, those 2 components of freedom and autonomy and trust will fluctuate depending on the relationship. So let's take a deeper look into this. The first relationship that he talks about is the relationship of agency. And here the client is merely telling the professional what to do, and the professional is merely acting as the agent. So the client says do this and that, and the professional goes ahead and does this or that. And in this relationship, the professional does not have a lot of autonomy because the professional is merely doing and serving as the agent of the client. So what the client says, the professional does. So there's not a whole lot of freedom or autonomy, at least for the professional. On the other hand, the professional, for the most part, trusts the client because these are the wishes of the client. The professional trusts that the client knows what the client wants. Hence, there's a decent amount of trust from the professional to the client. Now, the client in this relationship, as we've seen, has the autonomy and the freedom. The client is allowed to do what he or she wants and is free to tell what the professional is supposed to do. But in doing so, the client doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of trust. Hence, the client is telling the professional to do this or that. The second relationship is often seen as the opposite of the agency model. Here, in the paternalistic relationship, the professional has most of the autonomy and control. The professional is the one making decisions in the paternalistic role and telling the client to do this or that. And in doing so, the professional doesn't have a whole lot of trust in the client. On the other hand, the client in the paternalistic model doesn't have a whole lot of autonomy. The client, for the most part, is doing what the professional says that the client should do, or is merely in a passive role as the professional does the various tasks that need to be done. This also means that the client has a whole lot of trust in the professional. Since the professional has all the autonomy, since the professional is doing this or that or telling the client to do this or that, the client oftentimes has a lot of trust in the professional. Now, in addition to these two relationships, the agency and the professional, there are three alternative models offered by Faber. The third relationship is what he calls the contractual relationship. And here we're talking about a relationship that's bound by a legal and written contract. And in this contract, everything is laid out. What the professional is supposed to do, what the client is supposed to do, what the professional can expect from the client, and what the client can expect from the professional. So everything is on paper, everything is written down. So oftentimes this relationship is seen as the most fair. In this relationship, the professional's autonomy is limited by the contract, yet if the contract dictates, the professional has a certain amount of autonomy. Same thing with the client. In this relationship, due to the contract, the client's autonomy is limited, but if it's in the contract, the client has a certain amount of autonomy. Generally speaking, the professional and the client's level of trust are the same. The professional trusts the client as much as the client trusts the professional. And while this might sound good, there are certain setbacks to the contractual model. First is the idea that a contract cannot anticipate all aspects of a professional-client relationship. So what happens if something is not written in the contract? Or what happens if something arises and is not anticipated within the contract? There's sort of that gray area of things. Second, oftentimes a contract is written up by the professional. So in doing, the professional can have certain advantages if the contract is written up in a certain way. This relationship also implies that the client should have a certain knowledge of things, and if the client doesn't, the client is at a great disadvantage. The fourth relationship is called the affinity model. And here the relationship between the professional and the client is based on some sort of affinity apart from the professional context. It could be something like the professional and the client's children go to the same school, or the professional and the client's parents attend the same church. Some sort of connection that isn't rooted within the professional context. And when it works out, this relationship can be great. However, the drawback is that the strength of this relationship is contingent upon something that's not within the professional field. Just because our children are on the same sports team doesn't necessarily mean that this professional will be a good professional or this client will be a good client. So the amount of autonomy the professional has or the amount of trust the client has for the professional might be artificial based on this relationship of affinity. This brings us to the last relationship, called the fiduciary model. And here in the fiduciary model, the autonomy of the professional and the trust of the professional is based on the professional standards within that field. Whether you're working with an engineer or a doctor or a human resource manager, the idea is that the professionals within that field have set a certain standard, including moral standards of how the professional should operate. So the trust the client has of the professional is based on the idea that the professional is meeting the professional and moral standards that have been set out for that field. So the amount of autonomy the professional has goes only to the extent that the professional is meeting the standards of the field. When that professional doesn't meet those standards, then the professional's autonomy becomes less and the client trusts the professional less. So again, in the fiduciary model, the amount of autonomy the professional may have or the amount of trust the client has for the professional is contingent and based on the idea that the professional is meeting the professional standards within their field. So those were some concepts to think about when addressing the moral components of a professional-client relationship. Let me know what you think and come back for a future video.